actor Gene Hackman, along with his wife Betsy, have been found dead in their home in New Mexico.
The silence in the house was unsettling. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that makes your skin crawl. Too still, too long. The front door was barely cracked, mail stacked like bricks outside, untouched for weeks. When officers entered the Santa Fe home of legendary actor Gene Hackman and his wife Betsy Arakawa, they weren't prepared for what they found. Inside, time had stopped. Gene's body was discovered near the kitchen, still slouched in the chair where he'd taken his last breath. His sunglasses lay beside him, not shattered, just dropped. In the bathroom, Betsy's body rested beside a counter littered with pills. The sink was bone dry, the water long evaporated. There was no blood, no struggle, no forced entry. 2 of their dogs were alive, nervous, pacing. The third was dead in its crate. And then came the detail that turned tragedy into mystery. The bodies weren't fresh. They were weeks old. Mummification had already begun. The house was sealed tight, the air stale and unmoved. Food had spoiled, routines left abandoned. No emergency calls had been made. No visitors, no warning. It was as if the world had simply forgotten them. Until now. But someone hadn't forgotten. In the days that followed, investigators uncovered a trail. Financial transactions, surveillance footage, pacemaker data, and a story began to emerge. One that didn't end with natural causes. One that pointed directly to Gene Hackman's daughter, Leslie Anne Hackman. She was sentenced, stripped of inheritance, removed from his legacy entirely. But why? What exactly had she done? How much did she know before the bodies were even found? Whispers grew louder. Sealed court documents, blocked footage, a judge's last-minute redactions. The case was ruled closed, but the truth may be far from it, because the bodycam footage exists, and what the judge still won't let the public see might rewrite the entire story. The house on Circle Drive in Santa Fe was meant to be a quiet retreat, a peaceful hideaway for one of Hollywood's most iconic stars. But by the time authorities arrived, it had become something else entirely, a time capsule of death and decay. From the moment officers crossed the threshold, something felt off. The air was thick and stale, untouched for days, maybe weeks. Dust coated every surface. Rodent droppings marked the floors and corners. Cabinets had been chewed through. Investigators would later discover that Betsy Arakawa, Gene Hackman's wife, had been researching COVID-19 and hantavirus in the days before her collapse. A haunting detail given the rodent infestation that now plagued their home. The living room bore signs of sudden abandonment. Plates with uneaten food sat out, long spoiled. A fireplace was half prepared, never lit. Nothing looked violently disturbed, but everything felt wrong. Officers moved cautiously, calling out names that would never be answered. And then they found Gene. He was slouched near the kitchen table, unmoving. His glasses were on the floor beside him, not flung, just fallen. There was no sign of a fall, no struggle, no trauma. It looked like he had simply stopped. In another room, 2 of the couple's dogs barked nervously. They were alive, skittish, but not aggressive. A third dog, however, lay lifeless in its crate. There was no sign of abuse, just another unanswered question. Bodycam footage would later reveal a detail that raised even more eyebrows. As police began processing the scene, Hackman's daughter, Leslie Ann, arrived and quickly tried to take control. Calmly but firmly, she instructed officers to cremate the dead dog immediately. Her tone was not frantic, not emotional, just direct. That moment, captured on tape, would become one of many that caused investigators to pause. The rest of the house told a quiet horror story. Prescription bottles were scattered on counters, but some were missing entirely. Gene's pacemaker had recorded its final beat nearly a week after Betsy was believed to have died. There were no emergency calls, no notes, no signs of attempted escape or help. Just silence. Outside, neighbors admitted they hadn't seen the couple in weeks. Some noticed the mail stacking up. One even said they thought about checking in, but assumed the couple had gone on a trip. The house, despite its oddities, had hidden the truth well. Detectives moved room to room, looking for anything that could explain what had happened. Then they reached the bathroom, where the quiet mystery turned into something much darker. Because when they opened the door, reality got even darker. What made this case so chilling wasn't just the discovery of two lifeless bodies in a sealed-off house. It was the data that followed. Science doesn't lie, and in this case, it told a story no one was ready to believe. It started with Gene Hackman's pacemaker. The device, installed years earlier to monitor his irregular heartbeat, turned out to be one of the most critical pieces of evidence in reconstructing the final days inside that house. Forensic analysts pulled the device's log and found something shocking. The last recorded electrical activity, the final beat of Gene Hackman's heart, came around February 18th. That detail changed everything. Just days earlier, on or around February 12th, Betsy Arakawa had already died. Her autopsy later confirmed signs of a rodent-borne virus, hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, likely caused by exposure to infected rodent droppings or urine. Her lungs were severely congested, and blood work showed immune system activity consistent with a viral attack. Authorities later discovered her personal browser history on a home tablet, searches for COVID, shortness of breath, and rodents in-house. The house was infested. By the time Gene collapsed, he had already been without help for nearly a week, alone, fasting. The toxicology report revealed something few expected: high levels of acetone in his bloodstream, a chemical byproduct of starvation or diabetic ketoacidosis. He hadn't been poisoned. He had been slowly shutting down. The medical term for what he experienced is inanition. In simpler terms, he wasted away. Investigators noted the absence of basic survival efforts. No calls made, no signs of searching for food, no 911 attempts. It was as if he either didn't try or couldn't. Meanwhile, police began digging into what else the home's technology might reveal. Motion sensors embedded in the security system recorded scattered movement throughout the house between February 12th and 18th. No consistent patterns, just small irregular bursts. A shadow in the hallway, a figure moving from the kitchen to the bathroom. Then nothing. Outside, things got even more suspicious. Surveillance footage from a neighbor's camera showed a car parked on the street across from the Hackman home, multiple nights in a row, always between midnight and 3 a.m. The same car, same location. No one ever exited or approached visibly. But the timing? It aligned almost perfectly with the days leading up to Gene's death. Detectives tracked cell tower pings near the house during that exact period. They found a number, a burner phone, that had bounced between towers using tower hopping, a common method to mask location. The number was unregistered, but the pattern was telling. Then came the breakthrough. Digital forensic experts matched location data from Anne Hackman's phone to pings near her father's home on February 15th and 16th. Her official statement claimed she hadn't seen or spoken to her father in weeks. She told investigators she had been out of town. But her phone told a different story. Text records revealed conversations with financial advisors and legal counsel during those same days, discussing matters related to her father's estate. She was preparing documents, shifting accounts, asking questions about inheritance law, all before he was even declared dead. Investigators now had a grim timeline. Betsy died first, likely overwhelmed by hantavirus complications. Gene, with a failing memory due to Alzheimer's and no access to help or food, slowly followed 6 days later. No one intervened. No one came, except, possibly, his daughter. So why didn't she call 911? Why did her phone place her near the property if she wasn't supposed to be there? And what was she doing moving estate documents and contacting lawyers in the days leading up to his death? Someone had been watching, someone knew, and someone let it happen. Because someone was watching, that pacemaker and the daughter's phone logs painted a chilling picture. From the very beginning, Leslie Anne Hackman claimed she was blindsided. She told investigators that the last time she spoke to her father, everything seemed fine. He sounded like himself, she said, calm, content, and in control. She even mentioned they had spoken not long before he passed. That was the first red flag, because when detectives pulled the phone records, they found nothing. No calls, no texts, no voicemails, not in the weeks leading up to his death, not even a missed call. The timeline she gave didn't match the data. And in a case like this, the data always matters. What the records did show was activity of a different kind. Between February 12th and 18th, the same period when Betsy and Gene Hackman were dying inside their home, Leslie Ann was active, not in checking in on her parents, but in reaching out to lawyers and financial advisors. Multiple emails, multiple calls, some made from her personal number, others routed through a masked line. Conversations that circled around one theme: estate planning. And the most damning fact? Those discussions took place before her father was officially declared dead. She claimed she thought something was wrong when she couldn't reach him, but she never reported him missing, never requested a welfare check. Instead, she drafted documents, initiated bank transactions, and quietly laid the groundwork for what came next. Authorities later discovered that a significant amount of money, more than $30,000, had already been moved from accounts tied to Gene Hackman's name by the time police found the bodies. Investigators traced the funds through a maze of personal accounts, with some routed into investment portfolios and others flagged in offshore transfers. When questioned, Leslie Ann said she had power of attorney and was acting in good faith. But the paperwork had holes. The timing was too clean. And the signatures, at least one of them, raised questions that would later involve forensic handwriting experts. It didn't take long for the court to act. In a Santa Fe County ruling, Leslie Ann Hackman was formally sentenced for multiple counts of fraudulent activity, financial manipulation, and obstruction of a death investigation. The estate froze her access. Authorities seized thousands. She was removed from her father's will. No appeals were allowed, no inheritance, no legacy. But perhaps the most suspicious part of the case wasn't what was uncovered. It was what wasn't. Just weeks after the discovery of the bodies, media outlets pushed for full transparency. They filed motions to release the police bodycam footage, autopsy photos, and interior crime scene documentation. The public wanted answers, but a judge stepped in. While some materials, like audio clips and redacted documents, were allowed to surface, the most critical footage was sealed. The judge cited privacy. Out of respect for the deceased and their surviving relatives, the official order read, "The court deems certain media inadmissible for public release." It sounded reasonable on paper, but behind the scenes, journalists and legal analysts saw something else. The bodycam footage included the moment Leslie Ann arrived at the home. It showed her interaction with officers. It caught her demeanor, her first words, her unusual calmness. And just as importantly, it may have captured the layout of the scene. What was moved, what was untouched, and what seemed out of place. Why seal that? What was shown in those initial moments that made it too sensitive for public eyes? And who truly stood to benefit from keeping it hidden? Because if the daughter was already under investigation, why protect her? To this day, those questions remain unanswered. The case, officially, is closed, but the sealed materials sit in a courthouse archive, waiting, untouched, unseen. And despite the conviction, one truth remains locked behind that courtroom door. Because the judge's decision to block full access to footage, what is she hiding? When the final autopsy reports were released, the world expected answers. Instead, they got something murkier. A clinical explanation that didn't quite erase the cloud of suspicion hanging over the case. Gene Hackman, the two-time Oscar winner, had died of natural causes. The official diagnosis cited hypertensive and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, worsened by advanced Alzheimer's and congestive heart failure. His body had also shown signs of renal compromise. There were no bruises, no signs of struggle, no external trauma. His wife, Betsy Arakawa, had died days earlier, her lungs filled with fluid. The cause, hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a rare but deadly condition linked to rodent droppings. The infestation in the home aligned with the medical findings. Toxicologists found no drugs, no poisons. No one had slipped them anything sinister. And yet, something wasn't right. Gene had been on heart medication for years, closely monitored, prescribed regularly. Betsy also had medications she was supposed to be taking. But when investigators combed the house, the prescriptions were missing. Not just a few bottles, nearly all of them. There were no records of recent refills, no pill counts, no trace of a lapse in memory or routine that would explain such a total absence. It didn't look like they'd forgotten to take their medicine. It looked like their medicine had been taken away. And then there was the paperwork. As detectives were still trying to confirm time of death, using pacemaker logs, motion sensors, and toxicology reports, Leslie Anne Hackman had already begun preparing legal filings. Documents submitted to her father's legal team showed timestamps from February 16th, 2 days before Gene's pacemaker recorded his final heartbeat. Court filings later revealed that a draft revision of Hackman's estate documents had been created on that same date. Signatures were present, but unverified. Several pages were missing. Others were modified with vague language and crossouts. The defense would later argue that she had reason to believe her father was incapacitated and that she was only acting in his best interest. But the timing was damning. Investigators weren't even sure Gene was dead yet. His body hadn't been found. No coroner had signed off. No press release had gone out. And yet, the daughter was already preparing to revise his will. It's one thing to make plans after a death. It's something entirely different to make moves before it's officially happened. As this came to light, legal experts weighed in. Some called it a reckless assumption. Others saw it as a calculated maneuver, one that hinged on the hope that no one would look closely at the timeline. But prosecutors were already looking. And with every new discovery, that timeline began to close in. Phone records, emails, document trails, witness interviews. It was no longer just about grief, no longer about a daughter overwhelmed by sudden loss. The paper trail painted a different picture, a methodical, deliberate attempt to reshape a legacy, quietly and quickly, before the rest of the world knew what had happened. And that's what changed everything. Because the cause of death may have been natural, but the aftermath wasn't. And yet, before anyone claimed he was gone, she was already rewriting his will. The estate of Gene Hackman was once thought to be airtight. After all, this was a man who'd spent decades in Hollywood, known for playing calculating characters, but living a private, almost reclusive life off-screen. His will was expected to be simple, even modest. It named his wife, Betsy Arakawa, as the primary beneficiary. In the event of her passing, everything would flow according to a clearly outlined structure. That was the assumption. But once investigators got their hands on the documents, that assumption fell apart. The original will, filed years prior, was clean and organized. But the version discovered after his death was full of contradictions. Pages were missing, dates didn't match, and some sections, especially the ones that outlined specific distributions of wealth, were marked with new handwriting and redacted lines. Whole paragraphs were scratched out. Others were replaced with vague substitutions like remaining relatives or revised allocations pending signature. What made this version even more suspicious was the timing. The edits and notations appeared to have been made during the exact window between Betsy's estimated death on February 12th and Gene's final pacemaker signal on February 18th. And Leslie Ann Hackman was at the center of all of it. She claimed she had discovered the will in her father's safe and was simply attempting to sort out the paperwork in a time of grief. But investigators found that she had already been in contact with multiple law firms and financial planners before her father's body was discovered. These weren't condolence calls. These were transactional. Then came the forensic audit. Bank records, subpoenas, and asset monitoring revealed that significant sums of money, some in five-figure increments, had been moved discreetly across various accounts. At first, they were routed through domestic banks. Then, increasingly, they ended up in offshore accounts, particularly those in countries with tight privacy laws. The pattern was deliberate. Withdrawals were spaced just far enough apart to avoid automatic alerts, and the audit didn't just track where the money went. It uncovered when the transfers were triggered. Some of them were time-stamped before Gene's death had been confirmed. One batch was initiated the same day Betsy's estimated time of death was logged in the coroner's notes. And one large transaction, nearly $60,000, was flagged as legacy reassignment just 2 days before Gene's pacemaker flatlined. When reporters attempted to obtain public records related to the estate dispute, they were blocked. A judge ruled that certain documents would remain sealed due to their sensitive nature. The details of Leslie Ann's communication with her legal team, her access to the estate accounts, and her use of attorney-client privilege to shield email exchanges all became protected under that same order. But the police had enough. In a quiet but decisive courtroom hearing, Leslie Ann Hackman was charged and convicted of financial theft, fraudulent manipulation of estate documents, and obstruction of an ongoing death investigation. The court declared the revised will invalid. Her name was stripped from any claims to the estate. The inheritance, millions in property, royalties, and film residuals was frozen and reassigned. She had no right to it. No appeal would change that. In a statement released by the Santa Fe District Attorney, the verdict was described as a message to anyone who believes tragedy is a moment of opportunity. That was the end of her claim. The courtroom doors closed. The ruling was final. "Goodbye forever," the judge said as the final sentence was read. But as the files were packed away and reporters scrambled to piece together the timeline, there was one thing that still didn't add up. A single ledger entry, buried deep in the audit trail, remained unaccounted for. It wasn't large enough to trigger legal review. It wasn't tied to a familiar account. But it showed up in the hours between Gene's death and the moment police arrived. No one knows where it went. No one knows who moved it. And no one, not even the forensic team, can explain why it's still the one transaction that haunts investigators. As the timeline closed in and the evidence began stacking higher, investigators turned to one of their most reliable tools: surveillance. Not the type installed on walls or fences, but the digital kind. GPS records, cell tower pings, device history. They tracked Leslie Anne Hackman's every movement in the critical window between her mother's collapse and her father's final heartbeat. What they found raised more than a few alarms. Contrary to her original statement claiming she had been traveling out of state, Leslie's phone data showed repeated proximity to the Hackman residence. On February 14th, her GPS showed her within half a mile of the house. On February 16th, she was less than 200 feet away. There were no phone calls made to her father, no texts to check in, just silent presence. Then she was gone. At first, she denied the visits, claimed the data was faulty. Then she adjusted her story, said she had driven by to drop off mail and couldn't get in. But neighbors weren't so sure. One reported seeing a woman in a black SUV lingering outside the house in the early morning hours. Another said they thought they saw someone walking around the back fence line with a flashlight. Neither called it in at the time. Now, they wish they had. By the time authorities arrived at the property days later, it was too late to stop what had already been set in motion. But investigators made sure to collect everything: bodycam footage, audio logs, home surveillance drives. And then came a twist. In court, journalists petitioned for the release of the police bodycam footage. The judge agreed, to a point. Audio was approved, but the video was sealed. What the public got instead were blurred images, redacted stills, and courtroom transcripts. The footage had captured Leslie Ann's entry into the home, her first response, her interaction with the officers. But the visual context, the expressions, the reactions, the layout, was deemed too sensitive for release. Why? According to the court record, it was to protect the dignity of the deceased. But many suspected it was to shield something else. Then came the statements from two contract workers, hired by the estate just weeks before the deaths were confirmed. They were hired for light renovation, some electrical checks, some cleaning in the lower level of the home. One worker told investigators he was asked specifically not to go into the basement storage area. When he accidentally opened the door, he said he saw something he wasn't supposed to: a set of locked drawers, a removed floor panel, and boxes that weren't there the next day. The second worker said Leslie Ann arrived unexpectedly during one of their visits. She told them they could cut the job short and paid in cash. The visit, according to his records, was February 13th, just one day after Betsy likely died and 5 days before Gene's heart stopped. It was enough for detectives to return with a warrant. They searched the basement thoroughly this time. They didn't find bodies, they didn't find weapons, but what they did find raised new questions: a safe, a box of shredded documents, burnt envelopes in a fireproof trash bin, and something buried beneath a loose floor tile, an object that would take forensic analysts weeks to fully process. Because they found something buried in that basement, something no one expected. As public speculations swirled and media headlines tried to piece the story together, forensic experts were called in to interpret what the hard evidence alone couldn't explain. Among them was renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Barden, who offered one of the most compelling and unsettling interpretations of the scene inside Gene Hackman's home. According to Dr. Barden, the timeline wasn't just eerie, it was medically significant. Gene Hackman had advanced Alzheimer's, a degenerative condition that impairs memory, judgment, and basic survival instincts. Combine that with a sudden lack of nourishment, missing medication, and the psychological trauma of losing a spouse, and the result, Barden suggested, is a textbook collapse scenario. Gene didn't just die from heart disease, he likely suffered what's called a hypoglycemic or hypotensive event, a sudden drop in blood pressure or blood sugar that caused him to fall or slump without the physical strength to recover. Brain scans from the autopsy revealed signs of cerebral atrophy, a typical symptom of late-stage Alzheimer's, but also microbleeds, tiny hemorrhages that may have been triggered by a fall or extreme physical stress. According to Barden, it's very possible Gene collapsed after searching for help or after seeing his wife already in distress. As for Betsy, her death was equally tragic. The autopsy revealed lungs filled with fluid, classic symptoms of hantavirus pulmonary syndrome, a fast-moving viral illness spread by rodent exposure. The virus attacks the lungs and nervous system, often within days. If she had tried to care for Gene while sick, or collapsed first and left Gene to navigate alone, it would explain the strange pacing picked up by the motion sensors in the house, movements with no clear purpose, just two people in a slow, tragic unraveling. Still, questions remained. Legal experts debated the decision to seal certain records, particularly the bodycam footage and estate filings. Some argued that releasing graphic or sensitive material would violate the family's right to privacy. Others pointed out that this was a high-profile case involving possible financial crime and deception, and the public had a right to transparency. The issue isn't just about privacy, one legal analyst said, it's about accountability. If someone used confusion or grief as cover to commit fraud, then sealing the documents only protects the wrong person. Journalists pushed for more access. The court pushed back. Redactions stood. Video remained blurred. But the public kept asking, why hide anything if the case was really closed? As new pieces of evidence emerged, from forensic reports to shredded documents recovered from the basement, investigators began to ask different kinds of questions. Not about how the couple died, but about what wasn't done to stop it. Because sometimes death doesn't come from action, it comes from inaction. From letting something unfold when it could have been stopped, from knowing more than you say, from preparing before others even know there's something to prepare for. So did this tragic chain reaction point to neglect, or something darker? The courtroom was still when the sentence was read. No gasps, no sobbing, just the heavy silence that comes when a family legacy collapses in real time. Leslie Anne Hackman, daughter of one of Hollywood's most iconic figures, stood motionless as the judge delivered the final ruling. Convicted of fraudulent manipulation of estate documents, financial exploitation, and obstruction of a death investigation, Leslie Ann was stripped of all rights to her father's estate. Millions in property, royalties, and film legacy gone. The court ordered full restitution where possible. Frozen accounts were to be returned to the estate, and her name was to be permanently removed from any legal or public claim to Gene Hackman's legacy. No family members were present to support her. The courtroom camera feed, muted and tightly controlled, showed her shoulders stiffen, but her expression unchanged. The most the public ever heard came not from that day, but from the bodycam audio recorded on the day the bodies were found. In that clip, you hear her voice before you ever see her face. A calm tone, controlled breathing, a quiet request to cremate the dead dog. The officer asked if she had spoken to her parents recently. Her voice dipped slightly, almost undetectable. "I tried," she said. "They've been distant." Then came the final moment. Leslie's own statement before sentencing. She didn't admit guilt. She didn't ask for mercy. She simply said, "I only did what I thought was right." No tears, no elaboration. And then she stepped back, as if none of it was hers to carry. The courtroom didn't erupt. The press didn't shout. Everything was eerily subdued, like everyone in that room already knew how it would end. Outside, legal analysts deconstructed the case live. The forensic trail, the GPS logs, the financial records, every piece pointed to premeditation. But public opinion was split. Some believed she saw the deaths coming and acted selfishly. Others believed she panicked, made poor decisions, and got caught in a web too complicated to escape. And then there were those who thought something was still missing, because despite the conviction, despite the evidence, key elements remained sealed. Footage that captured the first discovery, documents redacted beyond recognition, a single audit trail entry that even investigators couldn't fully trace. When asked why those records weren't released, the judge cited privacy and sensitivity. "Some matters are too personal for public consumption," the court order read. But for many watching from the outside, that didn't satisfy the gnawing feeling that something was being held back. Gene Hackman had spent decades entertaining the world with stories of hidden truths, quiet tension, and explosive endings. Now, in death, he had become the center of a real one. With all this sealed, but everyone believes they heard the truth, what's still being hidden? In the end, the facts gave us a timeline. The courts gave us a verdict. And the experts gave us theories. But the story of Gene Hackman's final days still feels unfinished. We know the cause of death was ruled natural. We know Betsy Arakawa died from hantavirus, and Gene likely succumbed to starvation, Alzheimer's decline, and heart failure. We know the daughter, Leslie Anne Hackman, was sentenced and removed from the estate. And we know something happened in that house. Something strange, something silent. But what about the sealed footage? What about the missing medications, the altered documents, and the safe buried beneath a basement floor? What about the GPS records placing someone near the home? The financial transfers logged before death was even confirmed. The sealed courtroom exhibits no journalist has been allowed to see. Was this just a tragedy? A heartbreaking collapse of two lives, alone, in a home full of unanswered needs? Or was it something darker? A carefully timed, coldly executed plan to seize control of a legacy before the world realized what had happened. That's the part we may never fully know, because while the case is legally closed, the story still haunts those who followed it closely. The footage still hasn't been released. The evidence remains locked in boxes, and the final movements of those last days exist only in digital traces, shadows of a mystery we're still piecing together. So we turn to you. What do you believe really happened inside that house? Was this the slow unraveling of two lives isolated by illness, or a sinister move cloaked in silence and secrecy? Let us know in the comments. Your theory might help someone else see the story in a new light. And don't forget, when the sealed records are finally opened, when the footage is released, we'll be the first to cover it.